Okay, part 4, I believe this is. Title of this section, The Biblical Scrolls. And I'll read this part to you here, I think. It took years and many experts from around the globe to unravel the language of the scrolls. Conflict among scholars was common as the political and religious tensions of the time threatened to overwhelm the work. The tangled and sometimes acrimonious disputes regarding the Dead Sea Scrolls proved without doubt that in the 2nd century there were many forms of the Hebrew Bible in circulation. This is true. The biblical texts found in the caves were at least 1,000 years older than the previously discovered texts from the medieval period. Until then, the oldest known text and the foundation of all modern Bible translations. I mean, the stuff from the medieval period. As there was no agreed upon canon in the late 3rd or 2nd century BCE, it was common among the rising movement of rabbinic Judaism at the time to write paraphrases of the biblical books, sometimes creatively, skewing the content one way or another to serve various purposes. An alphabet soup of differing languages only added to the ambiguity and interpretive arguments. This goes back to what I said in the first video, that I've met people that when they found out I was a Christian or I was reading the Bible, they said, "Well, haven't you heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls?" Or somebody would bring that up. And finally, I said, "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, there's books. If you're using this Bible, there's books and letters that are missing, or weren't placed in it, canonized, or they've like he says, wrote creatively or paraphrased some of the source material that you're pulling it from. So how can you know that you have the real book?" Okay. First, it's not a book. It's a book of many books and a whole bunch of letters. And so that creates, for a lot of people, that can create a lot of doubt. Gee whiz, I mean, what if the things we're supposed to be doing are in those other letters or other epistles or other books that weren't canonized, that weren't in this? So you get this people can lack confidence in what they're doing. Okay. Typically because we depend so much on our intellect. Okay, and to be perfectly honest, the spiritual experience, the Bible is not a intellectual exercise. It's got to depend on the spiritual, but that's not. I'm not making excuses for it. This becomes a big. I've met people that didn't go a step further. Once they learned about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they went no further in their faith. Some, they like the idea because they don't want to go into their faith anyway. So it just depends on the person. But you can see where this can create a lot of doubt for many. Among the discovered scrolls were copies and recopies and reinterpreted copies in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Language plays tricks with the human mind. Words can be troublemakers. Take, for example, the word righteousness, which has come down to us from the Greek through Plato and St. Paul. The original definition of the word was ideal goodness for the whole of society. In Latin, the translation from the original Greek became justitia, coloring a shade of legality onto the concept and creating centuries of consequences for theologians and philosophers. These variations of tone and implication in language have the power to topple or support entire foundations of thought. Imagine then the gravity and the responsibility conferred upon the scholars whose task it was to sort out these thousands of precious fragments. I will make one note of something, and that is the Greek language is very specific. And many will say, well, that's why they chose that God chose that time, but it's we still misinterpret some things, but that's for different doctrinal stuff, our own interest, or some church has their own way of doing things, whatever. But the Greek language is very specific, which should make things easier. In addition, there were likely scores of individuals through the years responsible for the authorship of these texts. Handwriting comparisons, style quirks, and quality of work were all factors to consider as more and more scrolls were uncovered. The excavations in Qumran and beyond provided an ever-increasing collection of antique texts for scholars to pore over. The state of Jordan claimed ownership of the scrolls as they were technically found within its borders. Jordan gave access to the scrolls to Roland Diva, who pulled together an international team of scholars that soon went to work. Cave 4 had provided the largest quantity of fragments, but also the least well preserved. It was an operation of excruciating delicacy to access the contents of the badly decomposed material. In the words of team member Frank Moore Cross, many fragments are so brittle or friable that they can scarcely even be touched with a camel's hair brush. Most are warped, crinkled, or shrunken, crusted with soil, chemicals, blackened by moisture and age. The problems of cleaning, flattening, identifying, and piecing them together are formidable. The scope of this massive undertaking is illuminated by its results. The official publication, Discoveries in the Judean Desert, ran to more than 40 large volumes, which did not even include all the work, much of which was published outside the series. The first volume appeared in 1955 and 4 more in the 1960s, by which time the Rockefeller University funding had expired, and many members of the original team had gone on to prestigious academic appointments. From the beginning, the scrolls inevitably aroused political rivalry, resentment, and acrimony. Who had access to them? Who had legal ownership? Who had the right to publish them? Who was rendered biased by religious or political affiliations? Were the scrolls more significant to Judaic or Christian history? Were they in fact the work of an Essenic community, the Essenes, or was that speculation? Originally, Jordan claimed ownership of the scrolls, but after the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel took possession of what some people refer to as spoils of war. Jordan still claims rightful ownership and has filed a complaint with UNESCO suing for the documents' return. The original official team of scholars appointed by Jordan consisted primarily of Catholic priests who, it has been claimed, had reason to stifle the suggestion that the scrolls were the product of the Essenes, as this could be construed to cast doubt on the uniqueness of Jesus. Hebraic scholars felt that the scrolls belonged to Judaism as they were written primarily in Hebrew and could perhaps be lost parts of the Torah. As the years passed and the scrolls were pieced together and translated by Diva's original team, there was a public outcry for greater access to the originals and accusations that they were being hoarded. Having labored over the fragments for years, Diva's scholars were outraged that their efforts were dismissed by some members of the academic community as biased, and that a new generation of scholars was publishing commentary about the scrolls without giving due credit to the original team's work. By the 1990s, more than 40 years after the scrolls had first been studied, public pressure on the International Antiquities Authority, IAA, to release all information on the scrolls became too intense to resist. Called Insular Jerks by William Safire of the New York Times, the IAA finally released its stranglehold and lifted all restrictions on access to the scrolls. Far from putting an end to the controversies, this move simply expanded the arena. Anyone was now free to publish opinions on the meaning of the ancient texts, but the scholars who originally transcribed them were, in many cases, neither consulted nor acknowledged. Though ancient text cannot be claimed as personal property, reconstruction and interpretation can feasibly be cited as partial ownership. Academics and laymen with access to the transcribed scrolls can now interpret them any way they like, and agendas of all sorts can be furthered by the skewing of a phrase or word. Was the ruin at Qumran an Essene community, or simply a hiding place for the Jews to deposit their scrolls? Was Jesus an Essene? Was he one of several crucified teachers? Or was he unique, the only begotten Son of God, who happened to be in the neighborhood? None of these questions have been definitively answered, though many people have cited the Dead Sea Scrolls to prove various theories. Almost done here. Only 24 when he went to Jerusalem from Oxford to work on DeVos' team in 1954, John Strugnell was something of a wonderkind, known for his remarkable facility with ancient texts. Though he was eloquent and elegant in his speech, his appearance was sometimes alarmingly disheveled. He couldn't drive a car, and his torturing perfectionism kept him from the prolific level of publications that he was capable of. By the time he was appointed editor-in-chief of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1985, he had spent 30 years of his life immersed in them. And though it was evident by now that he suffered from both manic depression and alcoholism, he was the only qualified candidate for the job who actually wanted it. His greatest contribution was to invite Israeli scholars to collaborate in the translation and editing process. He also managed to publish the findings of the Fourth Cave, or Q4MMT, an accomplishment that both established his expertise and led to his downfall. Until then, the academic world believed that all the important scrolls had been published. But with the disclosure of K4, a resounding cry went up to demand that the entirety of the Dead Sea Scrolls be made public. There was now a second generation of scholars, many of whom had studied with members of the original team. These younger scholars, armed with technological advances and a larger body of knowledge, were making reputations for themselves through their work with the scrolls. The wider the circle grew, the wider the seeds of discontent and rivalry were strewn. Two contentious scholars of this new generation, Robert Eisenman and Philip Davies, publicly requested access to certain scrolls. Strugnell denied the request, and a frenzy of defamation ensued. Soon after, Strugnell was relieved of his editorial position and was placed on medical leave from his teaching post at Harvard. He died back home in the United Kingdom in 2007. The appointment in 1990 of Emmanuel Tov as editor-in-chief of the International Dead Sea Scrolls Publication Project was significant both because he was Jewish and because he was the antithesis of Strugnell. He believed that more eyes on the scrolls would lead to further understanding. He enlarged the editorial team to include, at its peak, 50 scholars. His tenure was prolific. He published more material on the scrolls than had been seen in the 40 years since their discovery. He created a scrolls catalog that included even the smallest fragments found and their translations. Tov saw to the publication of 33 volumes, 2 concordances, an electronic edition of all the biblical Qumran scrolls, and a 6-volume printed collection intended for the general public. Born in Amsterdam in 1941, during the German occupation, he was raised by his aunt and uncle after his parents were killed in the Holocaust. He immigrated to Israel in 1961, where he is the J.L. Magnus Professor of Bible Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And we're just going to keep that right there. The next section here is. We'll talk about the War Scroll next. Anyhow, love you. God bless.